Our presenter tonight is Bibi Gaston, the great-grandniece of the famous forester and conservationist Gifford Pinchot, a nationally recognized and fully licensed professional landscape architect. Bibi has provided landscape architecture, site planning, and design services for public and private clients throughout the United States since 1986. Gaston had her first book, The Loveliest Woman in America, a tragic actress, her lost diaries, and her granddaughter's search for home, published by William Morrow, HarperCollins in hardback, and by Harper Perennial in paperback edition. Please welcome Bibi Gaston.
Thank you so much for having me. Is this working? Seems to work. Okay, or I'm loud. I don't know. Joan is here. Where's Joan? Thank you, Joan, for helping put this together, and Celia, certainly. Also, Tara. She feels like a sister. She feels like a sister to me, and we're all here thanks to, I think. Well, I'm here. I know. Thanks to Jackson Eno. How many knew Jackson in this crowd? Okay, almost half. As many of you know, Jackson invited me to come to Simsbury back in, I think it was 2010, about a year and a half or so after the book, the book on my grandmother came out. I didn't speak in this space, but my first book was The Loveliest Woman in America, about my grandmother, who I really didn't know very much about until after my father died, and I received her diaries. And lo and behold, I learned that I was the great-grandniece of Gifford Pinchot. I had sort of known that I was a Pinchot, but it was unclear to me exactly how I was related, and it really didn't matter. What was really important was how important Gifford was, and that I had become a landscape architect, really not knowing that Gifford Pinchot was as involved in the land and in the conservation of landscapes nationally, and as it turns out, globally, since his death. And so I wrote this book about my grandmother, and then I kind of, while I was researching this book, I discovered 5 most remarkable boxes of letters at the Library of Congress, which constituted about 5,000 pages of original material that was written between the years 1937 and 1941. And this was an incredibly interesting correspondence that at first I thought, well, this is just fantastic writing. But the correspondence was between Gifford and what we call his first class of American foresters. Now, this wasn't literally his first class of American foresters, but the book title, it sort of worked with the book title. So just to back up a second here. So my first book came out in 2010, as I mentioned, and Jackson invited me to come here to Simsbury to speak about it. And I didn't really realize that I was sitting on a gold mine with these letters that I had also discovered simultaneously at the library in the Pinchot collection, which is 2 million documents of material. Gifford Pinchot, you just kind of lean a little into the story, and more and more and more material comes out. The entire family was political, and I promised my enemies that I would not speak about politics tonight, or my friends, really. But in any case, Gifford is, as it turns out, perhaps one of the most political of animals that one will ever encounter in American history. He really barely separated. There was very little separation between the personal and the political in all the Pinchot's lives, and they all had very strident opinions, and they voiced them for better, for worse, and But this piece that I'm speaking with you about tonight sort of falls in a different category because these letters that I discovered had been sort of sitting off to the side, and they tell a different kind of story. They don't tell the story of Gifford's life so much, but indirectly they do. Indirectly they do, because he queried between the years 1937 and 1941. He decided that he was going to query that first class and he asked them what was most important about their service. And the letter that he sent them was truly a remarkable letter, and I'm going to read it to you right now. And then we'll go through some slides to show you the results of that letter. This letter. The slides are fun because they show you really how the work of the very first foresters manifested itself on the ground in terms of projects. So there's nothing kind of fluffy. And Cornelia reminds us of this quite often during her lifetime. There's nothing fluffy about conservation. It's exacting. It's scientific. It's based on fact. It's not based on hypothesis or guesswork. And I think I could very easily get into what exactly that means to us today, but I think it becomes imperative that we look back at history to firmly place Pinchot's contributions in the realm of the scientific, not fluff, not hypothesis. The Forest Service was originally based on science. So this is the letter that he wrote, that Gifford Pinchot wrote in that first class, and it can just kind of set the scene. Imagine you're anywhere between the ages of 18 and say 26, and you don't quite know what you want to do with your life, and you read an article in a newspaper, in a magazine, and it's a invitation in a way to learn about the subject of forestry. And this is around the year between the years 1905 and 1910, that Gifford had, the subject of forestry started to show up in an awful lot of magazines and periodicals in the United States, describing this newfangled thing called forestry. And many, many men and quite a few women responded to the call. It's basically a call to become involved in this great national movement, and it was truly thought of as a national movement. And so these letters that Gifford sends out between 37 and 41, just 5 years before he dies in 1946, are in a way a way of he sort of was summing up his life. He was trying to look back and say, well, what have I done? You know, he had certainly been a leader on many stages in the United States, but he wanted to hear from his men for the first time what it meant to them to be involved in this great national movement, which was conservation. And nobody had known what forestry was at the time. We have to recall that, you know, when he first left the United States to go study forestry in France, there was a reason for that. He was not escaping the United States. There simply was no formal education in forestry in those early years. The most important book that Gifford read on the subject of conservation was really George Perkins Marsh's 1865 Man and Nature. How many people are familiar with that book? Okay. It was Gifford's Bible. And if you go to Grey Towers, if you get a chance to go to Grey Towers, how many have gone to Grey Towers? Okay, well, you'll find Man and Nature under like a little, it's like in a little terrarium that it's protected, because Amos Pinchot gives Gifford Pinchot Man and Nature on his 21st birthday. And that book becomes truly the the special spirit of Gifford's, the basis, I think, for Gifford's thinking in terms of conservation. So here's the letter he wrote. Dear old timer, and this is written in 1937, recalling those early years, 1905 to 1909, when Gifford served. Dear old timer, the record of how the Forest Service was born, fought, conquered, and grew up is of national importance and surely ought to be preserved in full. I want to do what I can towards assuring that the story of what we did, what we faced, and why gets told straight. And I am trying to put down what I know about it and what I had to do with it, with the idea of printing it in a book. In this undertaking, I need and very much want the help of all old-timers. Many of those who were in the service during my time have already been of immense assistance. Taken together, the narratives are of almost unbelievable historical value. I want to make the collection as complete as possible so that the story of the service may never be lost. What you send in not only will help me with my book, but also will be permanently preserved with other similar historical material in my possession in the Library of Congress. Your personal experience should be made a part of this record. In your story, I hope you will describe the positions you have filled, your duties in each, the names of the persons, places, descriptions of early conditions, and anecdotes, all that you possibly can, and especially dates, so that what you send can be combined with the accounts of others. Above all, I want a picture of your work, year by year, told in your own way, and of conditions under which it was done, the difficulties you had to face, the opposition or cooperation you met, and from whom, the friendly or hostile public sentiment at the time, and if it changed, what made it change. In fact, you cannot give me anything I will not be glad to have. I hope that you will give me the reason or influence that made you go into forestry. I thank you most heartily in advance for your help to your old chief, who sends you his best appreciation and regards, Gifford Pinchot, Milford, Pennsylvania. So if you can just imagine what it was like to receive that letter from your boss. Some of the folks had retired quite recently who responded. Others had retired 10 and 20 years ago. The responses range in length from about one paragraph to one page to 150 pages. They were writing term papers. And there is just absolutely nothing in the natural resource category that these letters do not touch upon and have, I insist, relevance to not only the current Forest Service employees, but also retirees, as well as, I would say, average citizens, as to how did this notion of conservation actually get its start. And so I think that what we find in these letters is something I would call a narrative arc of conservation. Certainly, these are some of the, I would say, most important founding documents of conservation thinking from the men on the ground, men and women on the ground. And it's a story of resilience and endurance and bravery on the part of the men and women of the U.S. Forest Service that I guess I would say has not fully been embraced. And I think at these junctures in history where we find ourselves right now, in particular with so much fraught energy, it's quite instructive and I think helpful to look back at these founding documents and to understand how the Forest Service and how so much of conservation did get its start, which we find in these documents particularly focus on trees, reforestation, and water conservation. And the reason, of course, that the Forest Service was formed was in part because there was thought to be a wood famine. And I'll go into that a little bit in just a second. During these years, well, I had always thought when I was growing up that the CCC and the WPA were established under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And in fact, formally they were, but the origins we find vis-a-vis these, through these documents that I describe in the book actually reveal that that the notion of service and conservation service actually starts quite a bit earlier. So one particular forester, actually friend of Pinchot, by the name of Francis Cuddle, who lived in Riverside, California. I went to visit his grave last week while I was out in California, and he writes Pinchot with quite some depth about the fact that he raises his hand and he said, no, I was the one who first thought of it. I was the first one who first actually suggested that a service corps could be established to dig underground water storage areas in the area surrounding Riverside. So I'll show you some slides of that in just a second. So I was quite surprised to find that that these efforts had actually begun under Theodore Roosevelt's collaboration with Gifford in those late 1800s and early 1900s. During these years, it was a commonly held belief that our national resources were limitless, as many of you know. The forest and water and minerals, it was thought, would last forever. But so this book, Man and Nature, becomes remarkably important in the thinking of both Pinchot and Roosevelt, because Marsh had warned of the possibility of collapse through deforestation. And something needed to be done, and quickly, in those late years of the 1800s and early 1900s. So in 1907, 2 years after Gifford took the helm of the newly created U.S. Forest Service from the previous Division of Forestry, Theodore Roosevelt established what was called the Inland Waterways Commission. And for the first time, a connection was made between forests and waters in this country. In its first report to President Roosevelt, the Inland Waterways Commission stepped up to the plate. During a trip down the Mississippi River, it was suggested that there be a national conference, a conference of governors, which on May 13th, 1907, met in the east room of the White House. And it was quite an august group. Who was there? The president, the vice president, 7 members of the cabinet, 9 Supreme Court justices, many members of Congress, 34 governors and representatives and from the other 12. Members of the Inland Waterway Commission, according to author Charles Richard Van Hise in The Conservation of Natural Resources in the United States, he says about that meeting, never before in the history of the nation had so representative an audience gathered together. For the first time in the history of the country, the governors were assembled to consider a great national question. President Roosevelt thought that the question of conservation was one of fundamental importance. Never before in the history of the nation had the scientific men of the country met upon equal footing with those engaged in politics. So what emerged from this conference, you ask? The appointment of a National Conservation Commission consisting of 49 well-known men, 1/3 from politics, 1/3 from industry, and 1/3 from scientific work. So this is the kind of vision that Roosevelt had. At the first meeting of the commission held in Chicago in June 1908, it was determined by resolution that we needed to study what was left. So 100 years ago, Pinchot and Roosevelt knew we were in a little bit of a debacle regarding what was left in the way of timber and thus water, because once again they saw that connection that was formed. So we needed an inventory, according to Van Hise, of, quote, the existing available resources, what proportion of these resources we have already been that have already been utilized or exhausted, the rate of increase in their consumption, and if this rate continues, how long these resources will last. But the Commission, as usual, had no funds at its disposal. So does that sound familiar? So the enter stage right in our narrative are the foresters. And some of these folks that I will show the slides of in just a second went out on the ground and started counting things and figuring out where stuff could happen. Where could nurseries be established? Where were the watersheds? They were mapping. They were surveying. They were counting. They were thinking, in part because this sort of global picture that Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot had first off the need to basically do what we landscape architects do, which is to establish a baseline. What do we have? Where is it? And how can we ensure this was an insurance policy for the future? The report sent from the President to Congress in 1909 was assembled in order to allocate funds needed to make this inventory. And Van Hise says it was an immense advance over guesses as to the natural wealth of the country. From this report of 100 years ago, the report was called the National Conservation Commission, Senate document number 676, 60th Congress, second session, Washington Government Printing Office, 1909, created the first framework, as I think of it, for a massive plan of landscape evaluation, locating and building nurseries, planting and reforestation. So these were back in the days when we could do anything, and we didn't argue as much as we perhaps get involved in argument now. So Pinchot and Roosevelt knew that we had lost our trees. We had lost a good percentage of our trees. And I had just come from California this past week where... So Connecticut has 3 million acres of land. Does anybody know how many acres of land are in California? 100 million. And guess how many acres right now are what we call in tree mortality state? 7.7 million acres of trees that are dead and dying. So that's the bad news. The primary reason, of course, is drought, as you've probably read about, and tree stress caused by bugs, elimination of fire in the landscape, and heat, which really is the big story on the horizon, is the global heating. The good news is that the U.S. Forest Service has a small team of people working on tree mortality issues. This is very exciting, and I did meet with some of them. Efforts are being made to look at what the next generation of forests actually looks like and becomes. More bad news. I learned that no sooner had it rained for a year than California announced the drought was over. So the answer seems to be to cut down the forests and mill the trees. The good news is the Forest Service is still around despite 100 years of being told it shouldn't be around. And to answer some pretty significant questions as to what will happen with these lands. So Connecticut has 3 million acres, and it's not immune from drought, as most of you know. The Northeast and more northern latitudes will see a lot more rain, sort of a terrarium effect, and a lot more snow. But we have seen periods of substantial drought here in New England, and so I have a friend who studies climate, and he's always giving me the worst case scenarios. But that's what sometimes we landscape architects like to indulge our worst case scenarios, because it sort of, if things don't go quite that badly, we're very happy. So he says regarding this methane situation, and are there people in the audience who are sort of aware of the methane circumstances? Yeah, just one. Okay. Well, methane is really the issue, every bit as much the issue as is carbon dioxide. And As we know, the tundra is sort of buckling, and methane is released as the climate warms. And he says that if 2% of the frozen methane in the Arctic melts over a 2 to 3 year period, humanity goes extinct. If 5% of the frozen methane melts over 5 years' time, we go extinct. But if the methane stops melting right now, we will have approximately 40 years to save the planet. The chances of that happening are almost nil, but we can always foolishly hope. So Google methane if you get the chance, and I don't think you'll get depressed. I think that just the reality is that we need to be aware of this methane story as much as we're aware of the carbon dioxide story, which we're all concerned about. So I'm going to just show you some wonderful slides, and then I'm going to read to you one of the more inspiring pieces from the book, because, and I think I wrote this book in part because these guys were can-do people. These folks could do anything. You sent them out and tell them to plant, 1,000 acres, and they'll do it. And that is really the spirit that Gifford and Theodore want us to remember. That there are things that we can do, particularly in the way of planting and reforestation and restoration of the land. And as a landscape architect, this has been my entire life. So to not only just make us feel better, but actually give us hope for conserving so much of what has been lost already. So let's see. I'm going to see if I can manipulate this thing. So there he is, smiling, telling us that everything is going to be okay. And I do think that there's a reason for hope. Here he is. It is a greater thing to be a good citizen than to be a good Republican or a good Democrat. And I think Jackson Eno really, for those of us that remember him, would be someone who we could say epitomized that spirit here in Simsbury. So on the left is some kind of large dog that appears in quite a few of the photographs in the Pinchot archives. And so Gifford's in the middle, of course, and there's Mary Jane Eno from here in Simsbury, and Gifford's father, James, on the right. Tremendous influences. And sometimes historians like to sort of infantilize Gifford and say, well, he just was following the orders of his parents. He didn't really have a mind of his own. He had to do what he was, but I don't think so. I think Gifford Pinchot had a mind of his own. So I'm here to kind of sort of I'm not here to just defend the honor of Gifford Pinchot, but I think that he and the Pinchot family have been treated a little bit unfairly by certain notable historians. Noteworthy historians. Gifford Pinchot with his niece, Rosamond Pinchot, who was my grandmother, on the right, and nephew Gifford Pinchot II, circa 1907, on the left. There's Rosamond in my first book. And Gifford here is with the Skull and Bones at Yale, a secret society. And there he is in the class of 1909. And the man in the lighter colored suit, believe it or not, is Aldo Leopold, so the great wildlife biologist. And here is a photograph of where he went off to study in Nancy in France. Because, of course, there were I think there were no forestry schools here. Here's the pen that President Roosevelt used to sign the February 1st, 1905 act that created the Forest Service. And here's the Society of American Foresters, which, of course, Gifford started as well in the year 1900. And by the way, on the cover of the book, this is a photograph of the Society of American Foresters meeting in San Francisco which I found also in the Old Timers collection. There's everything in the Old Timers collection that you can possibly imagine. And of course, Yale School Camp. And the Forest Service has created a sort of a mock-up of the school camp at Milford, if you do get a chance to get out there. Of course, he served as governor, as you all know, of Pennsylvania 2 terms, 1923 to 27 and 1931 to 35, and he would have run for a 3rd term, apparently, except that Pennsylvania law did not allow for it. Chief of the USDA's Division of Forestry, starting in 1898. There he is with his one son, Gifford Bryce, fishing, his great... And Amos Pinchot, I don't know how many of you know about Amos, but he was my great-grandfather and quite a prolific writer, a polemicist, an attorney, had no small opinions. And there's the house. This was Gifford Pinchot's first restoration project, Grey Towers, of course, 1886, designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the Gilded Age architect, and it was a tremendous opportunity to test out restoration projects. So on that 21st birthday of Gifford Pinchot, here's the copy of Man and Nature that Gifford's brother Amos gives him from AEP or AREP, which is Amos Pinchot. Here's the book. And Marsh was a Vermonter, and he also served as ambassador to both Italy and Turkey. So he'd studied the Mediterranean, and he knew that the conditions were arid, were ones that tended towards desiccation and not terribly fertile once the trees had been cut down. So these are photographs that we find in Marsh. He had studied the Middle East. He knew the circumstances there. And Asia Minor, a view of the city of Afyon Karamisa. Man cannot at his pleasure command the rain and the sunshine, the wind and the frost and snow, yet it is certain that climate itself has in many instances been gradually changed and ameliorated or deteriorated by human action. The draining of swamps and the clearing of forests perceptibly affect the evaporation from the earth and, of course, the mean quantity of moisture suspended in the air. The same causes modify the electrical condition of the atmosphere and the power of the surface to reflect, absorb, and radiate the rays of the sun, and consequently influence the distribution of light and heat and the forces and direction of the winds. Within narrow limits too, domestic fires and artificial structures create and diffuse increased warmth to an extent that may affect vegetation. The mean temperature of London is a degree or two higher than that of the surrounding country, and Pallas believed that the climate of even so thinly a peopled country as Russia was sensibly modified by similar causes. George Perkins Marsh, 30th September 1847, in a speech to the Agricultural Society of Rutland County, Vermont. So fortunately, some of us have a great big Rolodex, and there's Theodore Roosevelt and Gifford on that trip on the Mississippi River, part of the Inland Waterways Commission. And what they had actually envisioned that this international conference be held in The Hague. They'd set a date, in fact, to consider the sort of a worldwide summit on conservation. Meanwhile, while all of this is going on, the Forest Service is just in its fledgling days. This is Joe Halm, who we meet in The Big Burn, and as part of the 1910 fires. I don't know how many of you have read that book. This was the letter that Gifford sent out to his foresters. It appeared in all sorts of different forums. And this is the way I found the Old Timers material at the Library of Congress in the 5 blue boxes. and each one of the foresters had his own file. I don't think anybody had actually had the sort of been qualified, insane enough to actually sit down and read this stuff, 5,000 pages of it. But I did, so there we are. It's not that I didn't have other things to do, but quite frankly, the material is so riveting, and there's so many stories in absolutely every one of the every one of the letters. That's just incredible. There are the foresters at the San Francisco, one of the Society of American Foresters meeting in I think it's 15. Gifford received everything. He received blue ribbons from cow shows. He received photographs of the first telephone tree, and this was a forest. You know, the telephone trees were basically forester climbs tree, cuts off top, and it becomes a telephone pole. And notes to him with best wishes for happiness all through the years. Just lovely little notes. Can you imagine sending this to your boss 30 years after the fact? And photographs of Buffalo Bill Cody, which are absolutely divine. Actually, this is Fritz Olmsted. I think this is Frederick Law Olmsted's cousin, I believe, who was also an early Forest Service employee. Wonderful photographs of just déjeuner sur l'herbe of foresters. You know, no cell phones. They're 100 miles from everything. There's maybe they're 500 miles from a train, who knows, but they're out there and they're singing to each other. So there are quite a lot of songs that show up in the book of things, and poetry that Gifford receives. Photographs of the very first Forest Service fire rig that's rigged up by one of the foresters. Just touching photographs of men in the snow, and they're out there. Come sleet, come rain, come hurricane. Photographs of early America, the early West, with the wooden sidewalks, and then just moments in the dialogue. This was from one of the foresters named Earl Frothingham, who lives in Biltmore, North Carolina, and he writes, Pinchot, I owe my first inclination towards forestry to an early passion for the study of birds. When I began a course in medicine at the University of Michigan in 1900, I was not satisfied that I was on the right track. The outdoors was in my blood. There was a rumor that a course in forestry was to start at the university, and I had a yen to find out what it would be like. I consulted your primer of forestry and Schlick's manual. They opened up a fascinating vista, and the die was cast. And then more poetry. Life. Those who travel fortune's road sometimes carry the biggest load. If times are hard and you feel blue, think of the others worrying too. Just because your trials are many, don't think the rest of us haven't any. Life is made up of smiles and tears, joys and sorrows mixed with fears. And although to us it seems one-sided, trouble is pretty well divided. If we could look in every heart, we find that each one has his part. And this is one fellow who said, I don't think I'd better tell any humorous anecdotes. That stuff backfires. Someone might see it and not like it. So, and the letter from Aldo Leopold, who was really thought of as something of a prophet, who suggests that he will send Pinchot the material that that he has, but the material, he says, perhaps will not be appreciated for 2 generations. So here we are. This is Francis Cuddle. I'll just quickly run through these slides. Francis Cuddle from Riverside, California, whose grave I visited last week. What's wonderful about this project is I can actually go back and find some of these folks in my travels and locate where they lived, and that's tremendously gratifying for me. Cuddle took these photographs, or at least submitted these photographs of rangers that, as I mentioned, were busy scouting and then locating areas for subsurface water conservation in Riverside. And here's a photograph of that very very early attempt to dig underground wells for water conservation, which is something that the foresters learned from European and I believe Middle Eastern examples. Damming of water. Also, a fantastic project in the Sandhill Plains of Nebraska, part of what became the Niobrara Forest, one of the largest, what turns out to be one of the largest man-made forests in the world. And one of the foresters that you'll read about in the book is sent out, and he learns about a University of Nebraska forestry and biology professor, and who has thought that this landscape once was a forest. And the forester that Gifford Pinchot hires is determined to find out, and sets to work on finding the right trees that will, in fact, vegetate this landscape. And this is pretty much sand. There is water, of course, underneath this area, but here's one of the very first Forest Service nurseries that was set up around the year 1909, I think, and the condition of the Sandhill Plains before the forest. And here's this report to the National Conservation Commission it's a report that's about this thick, and it becomes the basis, really, for the Forest Service and the origins of what becomes the effort to conserve natural resources from Roosevelt to Roosevelt. So we also see pieces of this, the thinking on this behind this effort in the WPA and the Triple Cs. So the foresters actually went out and mapped areas, regions of the United States, eastern region, the central treeless region, and the western region, forest planting regions. And you can see here in the sort of striped area, it says we have about 15 years supply left. So this is, I believe, is 1909. So they already knew they only had 15 years of supply of wood products. Hello, conservation. So some of the sections on this forest planting study were written by some of the very first foresters. This one by A.R. Peck, and Peck's story is in this book of his tour of trees of the South. They were studying water resources. Here's the map that describes the potential forest planting areas for nurseries spread out throughout the United States for those purposes of restoration 100 years ago. 100 years ago. So many of the forests, unfortunately, these nurseries have closed due to the lack of funding, but much of the efforts at reforestation are aerial as well as through seed mixes. They were also studying, interestingly enough, natural gas. There's Cornelia Pinchot on the left, and the governors, and I think one of the members of the Forest Service at the turning over of the Columbia National Forest to the Gifford Pinchot National Forest about 4 years after Gifford dies, and she gives a completely stirring speech on the importance of conservation, and that speech is in the book. So we're all here because, and this is, by the way, the very first Forest Service headquarters in Washington, D.C., just a few blocks from the White House on F Street, where all the action took place. And it was called the Atlantic Building. And one of the, how much time do I have? Do I have time to read one narrative? Okay, great. How much time? 15 minutes. Oh, perfect. Okay, great. So this is one of the narratives that I absolutely loved. And it's written by a woman named Agnes Scannell, who I say she's a hero to us all. She served in the Portland, Oregon regional office in 1907, and she actually hailed from Worcester, Massachusetts. And she was posted to Washington, D.C., Portland, Oregon, and Alaska before leaving the service in 1910. So she spent most of her life with the Forest Service. And I think one of the most exciting parts about learning, for me, about learning about these early foresters is these sort of 30-year, 25-year-long careers of not just men but women who give their lives their lives in service to truly what they perceived as a great cause. And I think the Forest Service it sort of holds that DNA. As I've traveled around, many of the Forest Service employees don't kind of know the story of their own agency, and how many agencies actually have a story like this, or have a man like Gifford Pinchot who comes from little Simsbury and creates this agency that really becomes the model for not just national but international conservation work. So it's terribly exciting. And here's what Agnes, this is a little bit lengthy, so settle in, please. So, my dear Mr. Pinchot, and she's writing him from Brighton, Massachusetts on December 27th, 1939. This is what she calls the personal narrative of Agnes V. Scannell. My dear Mr. Pinchot, your letter of December 11th, 1939 came as an echo of the past. It was like the response to a thought wave on the ether. Who writes like this anymore? Anyway, for just a year ago, on New Year's Day, 1939, while visiting my cousin Florence Donahue, Esquire, of Worcester, Massachusetts, I mentioned to him that I had been hoping I should someday have an opportunity to put in writing some facts about the Forest Service of the United States, because I felt a written record should be made of the efforts of Gifford Pinchot in establishing this important branch of government. Both my cousin and his wife can confirm this. I tell it to you so you may understand how happy I was when I received your letter asking me to write an account of my connection with the forest work of the government and to narrate my experiences in my own way. Since I served only as a young stenographer, I fear I may not be able to contribute information of much value. However, I am glad to send you herewith a narrative of my experience with the Forest Service from January 1907 to October 1910. Experiences of Agnes V. Scannell while stenographer with the United States Forest Service. Back in the year 1906, I spent the summer in Europe. It was my first adventure away from the conservative little city of Worcester, Massachusetts, the home of Honorable George Frisbee Hoare, former United States Senator, the late Rear Admiral Earl of the United States Navy, and the late Arthur Prentice Rugg, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. Those are only a few of the Worcester men who have served their country. I mention them in order to show that at the beginning of the 20th century, the high school students of Worcester could acquaint themselves with the lives of such men, whose achievements were inspirations to aspire. It was only natural, then, that the members of the graduating class of 1901 should hope to be of some service to their country. Gaining courage and ambition from my European trip, I returned home eager to go beyond the confines of my little city. So in October 1906, I took a civil service examination at Boston for the departmental service. In December 1906, I received an appointment to the Forest Service at Washington, D.C. It was just before the Christmas holidays, and I accepted the appointment with the understanding that I should not report for duty until January 2, 1907, and she worked in this building. Forth I went to Washington and reported for duty to the Forest Service, then located in an old rented building on F Street, Northwest. I shall have to admit that I was at first taken back, for I had seen views of the many beautiful government buildings shown in a National Geographic magazine, and I pictured myself working in one of those buildings. The Forest Service was a branch of the Department of Agriculture, and other branches within the department were spaciously housed in government buildings placed on spacious lots of land. Since I always liked space and a beautiful view, my early inquiries were directed for the most part as to why we were so crowded in our poor quarters. The response from my fellow workers was always the same, namely that the Forest Service appropriation was very small and that was the best we could expect. I was soon to learn that the congressional appropriations for the Forest Service were small indeed, and although the service was expanding in leaps and bounds, the appropriations appeared to be contracting in the same ratio. My appointment read clerk, stenographer, typewriter at $600 per annum. That was $50 a month, which was to cover my added living expenses since I was away from home, as well as all other maintenance There was, of course, little of my salary left at the end of the month, but money was not my objective. Experience was, and how fortunate I was to have those early experiences come to me in the Forest Service. My first assignment was in a crowded room where all new appointees were placed in order to try out their abilities and aptitudes. A young woman, whose name I have forgotten, was our supervisor. I shall never forget her graciousness and guidance. After a few weeks under her observation, I was assigned to Mr. Rowden's department. Here I was trained in the minutest detail of Forest Service procedure relating to correspondence, filing, and the care and distribution of departmental papers. It was here I began to sense the perfect organization, the splendid cooperation, and the remarkable courtesy all around me, as well as the excellent training I was receiving. Then the offensiveness of the congested quarters began to disappear from my consciousness. I am really at a loss to know how to describe the training each new appointee received before being given a definite assignment. No detail was overlooked, and one had passed through the training, and when one had passed through that training, he or she might forever measure up to the highest standard of secretarial efficiency. And that included the ability to set up letters in correct and artistic style, to couch or phrase a letter concisely and with dignity, to preserve and distribute carbon copies so carefully initialed and without the loss of a second, the one who dictated, the secretary who wrote, and the recipient of any paper could be identified. I can truthfully say that my training in the Forest Service served as the cornerstone for my success in later years, irrespective of the fields of endeavor into which I have entered, and they have been many and varied. So much for the training that every Forest Service secretary received. What a splendid system that was. No delays because of blunders on the part of new stenographers, no running about, looking for papers, no lost or mislaid papers, everything moving with efficiency and dispatch. Eventually, I was assigned to the Office of Boundaries in the service. In the service, each department had its appropriate name. Here, every desk was jammed against the other with barely enough room to move about, and I wrote all day about the southeast quarter of section so-and-so, the northwest quarter of section thus and thus, in township such and such. The work had little meaning for me, and I found it rather monotonous. By June 1907, there was a rumor that the Washington office was about to be decentralized and districts established in the West. In July, definite statements were issued and a call for volunteers was made for men and women trained in the Washington office who would be willing to go to the newly established districts in the West, where their training would be needed. There were to be 6 districts as followed: Denver, Colorado; Missoula, Montana; Ogden, Utah; Albuquerque, New Mexico; San Francisco, California; Portland, Oregon. Each one could make his own choice up to the time when all positions would be filled. Worcester will always be here when you want to return, but the opportunity to go west will not always be here. Regarding the choice of station, I talked with the late Honorable Rufus B. Lodge, who had been a personal friend of my mother. I shall always remember that interview. He thought the opportunity to go west a splendid one, and he advised me to select Portland, Oregon. I can see him even now as he tipped back in his office chair while he remarked that wonderful Pacific slope. Taking his advice upon my return to Washington, I immediately sought to change my choice of station and asked for assignment to Portland. I was told I might have it, but for few wished to go there because of the distance, while there was a waiting list for Denver. To those who volunteered to go west, a promotion of $300 per annum was given, as well as all expenses paid to the Western Post. That meant an increase of salary to $900, and it seemed like a big sum in those days, because there was an opportunity to cross the continent. I remember how I looked at the map daily and drew my finger from Washington to Oregon. Naturally, at times, a little faint-heartedness overtook me. I felt almost afraid to go, but I was young. I had the health and the strength, ambition, imagination, and all things that youth is heir to. We were all young. Almost everyone in the Forest Service was young, and everywhere there seemed to be that vigor, that onward push, that dauntless spirit that goes with youth. So there are quite a few more pages to Agnes Scannell's a recitation of her experiences. But she says at the end of her letter to Pinchot, which is quite a lengthy letter, "I shall now give the answer as to why in the early years of the service we all felt so strong mentally and spiritually, and why our old chief has lived and will live in our hearts always. The answer is engraved on the wall of the Congressional Library at Washington. It reads, quote, 'As one lamp lighteth another, nor grows less, so nobleness enkindleth nobleness.'" And she finishes by saying, "Gifford Pinchot was our lamp, and his nobleness enkindled nobleness. To the truth of these statements, I am glad to sign my name at Brighton, Massachusetts, December 27, 1939. Agnes Veronica Scannell." She's just like, oh my God. And there are quite a few women in the book whose accounts are equally as riveting. But along with this, the politics aside, we sort of sense the dignity and the sense of gratitude, I should say, for first of all these folks having a job at a difficult moment in American history, forming the sort of esprit de corps, and then 30 years later having your old chief send you a letter and asking you to tell them all about your life, which basically was their lives and continued to be their life in the Forest Service. So it's incredible as I go around the country learning that really the Forest Service grounded so many young people in their identities, and still does. So thank you for listening.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.